everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have online a special guest. This is our first webinar for International Floriculture Expo, or the new name is Flori Expo. And so we're recording this in the mid-March of 2022, and we have a super special guest. And as I mentioned before, he's one of our first guests of the year, and I couldn't be happier. We have economist Charlie Hall, Ph.D., the Ellison Chair at Texas A&M University. And you probably see Charlie all over, because literally we have about a half hour for this recording and this webinar. So I can't cover everything Charlie's involved in, but I know that you've seen him. And he spent, if I've read this right, Charlie, you spent 13 years at Texas A&M originally.
Right.
Then you joined the faculty of University of Tennessee in 2002.
Right.
Then you came back.
I did. Yeah.
In 2010 or 2007, I think.
Yeah.
And your title is Professor and Ellison Chair in International Floriculture.
Right.
Floriculture.
Right.
Now, tell me a little bit about, because I don't think the full audience knows. Tell me about the Ellison Chair.
Well, of course, the Ellison Chair is named after Jim and Ellen Ellison. And particularly Ellen was one of the ringleaders in the early stages of developing the endowed chair and going throughout industry and saying, we need to establish an endowed chair that's going to be specifically looking at the floriculture sector. And this particular position, unlike many other faculty positions, can't be reallocated when somebody retires, and there's always going to be a position in floriculture. And she convinced 64 other donors to donate $543,000 that the university then matched to form the chair. And I was not the inaugural chairholder. Dr. Ed Heiler, when he stepped down from being the vice chancellor and dean, he actually was in this role because they wanted him to, the advisory committee wanted him to kind of develop the first strategic plan for the chair. And then they started looking for the first person that would fill the chair, and that was me. And that's been about 15 years ago now.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so your expertise, Charlie, is, gosh, I could go on and on.
Well, I'm an economist.
Yes. First and foremost, in the green industry is your specialty, and you're nationally recognized with major research areas such as what do you cover basically?
Well, strategic management, financial management, marketing. There's so few economists that are working in the green industry that I'm kind of a jack of all trades. But I'm a marketing economist the way that I was trained, but 34 years in working with industry and so forth, I've developed a lot of skills and capabilities that I didn't have originally. So I'm pretty good on the finance side too, because it all comes down to making money. Otherwise, we're not in business very long. Well,
I was so impressed with, when floral sales were reported, here we are in COVID and we're going through the pandemic, and people were reporting double-digit sales growth. And I was saying all along in that's great. Of course, we want sales to grow, but we have to differentiate between inflation and a sales growth because prices are higher. I sold a dozen roses for $9.99 last year, and now they're $12.99. My SKUs may not have grown, but my retail grew, versus a growth in units, or a growth in SKU sales, or a growth in customer traffic, or average sale per customer. So it was very interesting. I was kind of saying that behind the scenes, and you were one of the first economists that mentioned that, because that's so important that we actually know, is the sales increase organic or not organic, as supermarkets refer to it. And I was really, I breathed a sigh of relief. I thought that differentiation is so important, and you're the only one I saw that mentioned that.
Yeah, well, that's the mindset that I think in. And so it was a paradigm that I know has been happening over the last 2 years. And what's interesting is that these inflationary pressures, they just didn't happen by accident, right? And I'm trying to go to stay away from politics because there's a lot of finger pointing by the party that's not in control, but towards the party that is controlled. But that's happened since we were a country, so that's nothing new. But these inflationary pressures are really the result of a supply chain gone awry. We had spent 4 decades, literally 4 decades, perfecting a global supply chain that was just in time in nature, and particularly for flowers, because flowers are highly perishable. So we have a very sophisticated, cool supply chain that we're trying to maximize shelf life of flowers all through the floral supply chain. And, you know, COVID threw it put a lot of wrinkles in that supply chain. And so when you throw a global pandemic on top of a global supply chain, it takes a while for those wrinkles to be ironed out. And so much of the inflationary pressure has been because it's costing more to get product through the supply chain. The inventory levels that we have typically seen in the past have not necessarily been there. Now I'm talking about products both on the allied trade side and also, you know, the flower side. But we've done a pretty good job of ramping up inventory in the wake of that first few months of COVID. You know, when there were a lot of flowers thrown away and so forth, and a lot of disruption in the supermarkets. They were putting essentials into their warehouses.
Yes. And we weren't one of them.
I know. It was terribly frustrating.
Go figure.
Even though now I think people realize that because of the health and well-being benefits associated with flowers, that they really are an essential, because we saw floral sales during this last 2 years really increase fairly dramatically given other SKUs in the supermarket. So it's been interesting in terms of seeing that supply chain, but we're not out of the woods yet. So get back to the inflationary pressure. So you got the supply chain pressures, you've got the cost of all these inputs, all the way back to production, all through the supply chain. The cost of everything has been increasing. In fact, I developed an index of prices paid by growers. It's a special report, and I just finished it. And for the update, in 2021, the cost of inputs at the grower level increased 9.6%.
Wow.
So, and you know, as things move through the supply chain, margins get tacked on. So that means that the inputs for the retail florist obviously have increased. And then while that's been good in terms of the supply chain participants capturing greater profits, obviously it's made developed a situation where we've had to increase the price of flowers in order to increase our margins so we can pay for those higher cost inputs.
And labor. And labor now, labor. Minimum wage and all that stuff.
Yeah, because we've had significant wage pressure. Just in wages alone, by the way, there's been a 53% increase since 2007, right before the Great Recession, when things were at their kind of their peak. If you look now compared to then, which we thought was Lake Wobegon days and things were feeling pretty good, we're 53% higher wage costs, right? So our labor costs are significantly higher. And to basically encourage people to come back to work, we've had to increase wages. So the interesting thing about this inflationary pressure is, from an economics point of view, is it cost push, is it wage push, or is it demand pull? And the answer is yes.
Wow.
Yeah, this is one of the few times that we've seen the inflationary pressures being caused by both the rise in the cost of inputs, as well as the rise in wages and so forth, and then also the demand pull. Because remember, we put in the CARES Act, we put in child tax credits, we sent $1,200 checks to people, so we put cash in their pockets. And one thing we know about people, expenditures rise to meet income. income goes up, expenditures go up. But we couldn't spend it on services because we can't get to the bar, the
Oh,
hotel,
interesting.
the
There you
restaurant,
go.
and so
Mhm,
forth. So we're going, where do we go? We went to Amazon, right? So
mhm.
we bought stuff, and that exacerbated the supply chain issue, because now you've got 5 years worth of growth in e-commerce occurring in 1 year. And so you got all this stuff trying to get this stuff to the end consumer. And so that needs more containers, more ships, more trucks, more drivers. And we were 46,000 drivers short prior to the pandemic. Now we're 80,000 drivers short. And the ATA, American Trucking Association, says we may be up to 100,000 or more short by the time this thing is said and done, particularly in light of all the tonnage that's coming. So we're not going to get that much relief on freight prices right now, freight rates, right? So as you have these pressures increase, then the price of flowers has to increase in order to maintain those margins. And so if we're seeing people with increased sales levels, then some of that is organic growth because of the health and well-being benefits and the fact that people had money in their pocket, but they couldn't buy a car. They couldn't buy some of the other things, the services like I was talking about.
Well, they
So
didn't go on vacation, or, they didn't
exactly,
spend it on things like that. Yeah.
exactly. So they spent more on flowers, and then that increased the final demand. And so there you've got the complete picture coming together. It's a cost push, it's a wage push, and it's a demand pull. All three of those things working in concert to increase these inflationary pressures. And now you've got black swan events like Russia and Ukraine that's putting more pressure on the supply chain, but we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
And the effects of that. But yeah, there's been some organic growth. And if you look at the increases, like for this past Valentine's Day at the retail level, most people had somewhere between 0 and 36% increase in sales year over year. And so some people had a really good year last year. Some people had an okay year last year. In fact, if you look at growers, wholesalers, and retailers in terms of how they performed last year, the year over year comps, the growers were 45% of them said they were up year over year in 2021. The wholesalers, I think it was 41% that said that they were up year over year. But for retailers, retail florists, they were up 68%. Wait a minute, no, 66% year over year.
Yeah, 67 actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a pretty good year for florists and as a whole. However, not for everyone. Yeah, depending on what part of the country and what was going on in that part of the country. Some said that they had the same as they did in 2020, and some were even down last year.
Well, let me read for the audience. And first of all, you do a great job with working with SAF. And I love SAF because they report things that are very business savvy to the industry. It's not always about making arrangements. And I love looking at SAF's material and the things that, you present a lot of their trade shows, and it's probably one of their biggest sellers biggest attended events, I would say, because the economy changes. It's not, the economy changes by minute, as we're going to talk about later. But the stats from SAF is that they did a survey, and I think, let me check here, let me read it. They had 400 responders, all retail, grower, wholesale suppliers, 2022 Valentine. And it was, you were right, it says 67% had a sales increase. 13% had a 21 or above sales increase, 16% 11 to 15, 30% 6 to 10, 18% only a 1 to 5% increase. However, like you just said, 9% were down.
Right.
So 9% of the industry, according to their statistics, were down for Valentine 2022 versus last year. So
Right.
there are a few that are down, but overall we had increases. Some may have been, non-organic, some may have been organic.
Exactly. And so the question is, what percent of that is organic versus what percent of it is inflation and the price increases kicking in? I don't have a definitive answer. It's one of those things where they didn't ask that particular breakdown. So it's hard to, if we knew what the price increase was, then we'd have a little better feel there. So I don't feel real confident in guessing at this point, but we know that there was, I think a substantial part of it was the increases in price that we saw. Because the average ticket, I think, was $55.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was higher than the $53.60 that was the average ticket in 2021.
Yep.
And so again, I think that's 2.6%. I did the calculation earlier. It's 2.6% higher average ticket in this Valentine's Day than what it was last year. And again, I think most of that is probably wrapped up in the price increase. Yeah. There is some unit growth.
Yeah, most customers are repetitive in how they buy.
Yeah.
But still, I think there's a good story in that, even if you say, based on everything going on, I wasn't down. My customers responded to the price increase, because sometimes they reject a price increase. So at least we could say, well, they like me enough in my business that I had to raise my prices, and they still came to me and they still bought from me. And I think that in itself is a win, especially based on people aren't really leaving the house as much anymore. So the fact that the sales are up, whether it's organic, non-organic, and yes, we know prices went up both on the wholesale side and the retail side. I think it's still a good story to say, well, whether it's Kroger or 1-800-Flowers or FTD, customers still came to me. They still, if I had to raise my prices, they still understood that and purchased my product. And I think that's a good story in itself.
It is for the most part, but we can't forget about that 9% that went down. And you got to ask, well, why did they go down? And was it because of the lack of marketing? Was it that they raised their price too much? Again, we don't know the reasons there, but you're right. For most of the industry, again, it's been a pretty good year, and that's reflective of other consumer product goods as well. Here's an interesting factoid. From February of 2020, when COVID first started, to the end of last year, sales increased 21.9% in 21 months, right? 21 months, sales climbed 21.9%. Now that in and of itself sounds like a lot, and it is. But when you take from 2007, right before the Great Recession, fast forward till you have a 21.9% increase, it took 9 years.
Wow.
9 years
Seriously.
for us to get a 21.9% increase in retail sales. Now, that's not just flowers, that's all retail sales, consumer packaged goods and so forth. So we, in 21 months, did what it took us 9 years to do right after the Great Recession. So people were spending money. And when people are spending money at that rate, how can you not have inflationary pressure, right? Because expenditures rise to meet income. Now, wages have increased, so there's going to be some of that income increase that's going to be maintained. And there is some discrepancy among demographics, because if you look at the people who are not back to work yet, 34% of them are women. 23% of them are 65 and years and older. And it's interesting because during that time period, we had 1.5 to 2 million excess retirements. That is, we know that there's on average 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day. You do the math, 78 million boomers over a 19-year retirement horizon. It just comes out simple math, 10,000 a day. But there were 1.5 million to 2 million excess retirements. So I don't know that those people are going to come back into the marketplace. So while we lost 22 million jobs, we've gained all but 2.1 million of them back. But there's still, there were 4 million people that quit their job last month.
Go figure. Strange.
Yeah, I know. Now, the other big category of folks that haven't come back to work yet, if you look at the number of new business applications, we're rocking along through time around 200,000 a year, right? 200,000 new businesses. And then all of a sudden that jumps to 3 times that during the pandemic. Cindy, this is a life-changing event. And people said, you know what? Life's too short. I've always wanted to do X, Y, Z and own my own business doing X, Y, Z. I'm going to make that leap. I'm going to start a new business. And we saw that tripling in terms of new businesses being developed. So when people start looking around and say, why can't we get people to come back to work? Well, it's 34% of the folks missing are women. And the biggest sector we're having trouble finding people is in the child care sector. So there's a number of women that can't afford to come back to work because of child care difficulties. You got the excess retirements, then you got all these folks that are starting new businesses. And meantime, the participation rate is going up slowly, but not at the rate at which we can hire everybody that we need right now.
But so also think about, Charlie, too, and I've commented to my husband about this, how many people had to homeschool. I mean, it was almost like turn on a light switch. Okay, we're closing the school. And I looked at my husband many times these past 2 years, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm glad our kid has grown, because if I had to homeschool, I mean, it's like, but it's happened. Your kid was at home, and here you go. You have to manage their homeschooling online to make sure they're plugged in and doing it and listening and all that. Who was doing that? I mean, that's another thing where I think mothers, especially, you mentioned the female force, mothers in particular, and fathers too, I don't want to leave them out, but mothers in particular were home. How did they manage work, homeschooling, the husband working, and all of the other stuff that this brought to us?
Well, there's you look at stress levels and the mental health issues that we're now seeing arise from the pandemic, because we're going to see over the next decade, that's going to continue being a greater issue that we're going to have to wrestle with in this country, is the mental health aspects. And the good news is that flowers are a vital part of the remedy there in terms of securing mental health. Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to talk about what's going on now.
Okay.
It's like we had the first round of COVID. Oh my gosh, what's going on? Everybody thought it was safe to enter the water. And then we had number 2, Omicron. Come, here we go. And now what's going on in the world? It's like boom, boom, boom. It's always something. But this, we're living in unprecedented times. Before we get to that, though, I want to ask you about the eye tracking study. So, as you know, I'm a trustee, American Floral Endowment, Floral Marketing Fund, obviously as part of that. And you did a study on eye tracking, and you do many for that organization in addition to many other organizations. What was your biggest learning? And by the way, this could be found online at endowment.org, O-R-G. What was your personally biggest finding or most surprising finding when you went through that study?
Now that's a big, hairy, audacious question right there, because there were actually 6 studies within the one study. But I think probably the most surprising thing that we found is we were looking at the different attributes of floral designs that really appealed to customers. And we were looking at the flower form, and we were looking at line and forget all the elements of floral design that we included, but all of them were in there. But we also looked at the species that are used within floral designs. And is there something that's magical about a red rose, or could you substitute a different red species of flower?
Or
Exactly. Or ranunculus or whatever the case may be. And could you substitute a different flower with this kind of the same shape, form, or whatever of that red rose, and people still be willing to pay the price for that arrangement if they had roses or some other more expensive flower? We were substituting less expensive species for more expensive species, and then looking at the overall willingness to pay. And I think the surprising thing is that, well, wait a minute, we really can substitute within arrangements different species of flowers with keeping the same color scheme and shape and everything. And the consumer willingness to pay is still there.
Well, it's perceived value. And I've had many experiences where, we say as an industry, the tighter the rosebud, the better, because the customer, it's a longer shelf life at home.
Right.
But in a real retail environment, sometimes many customers will look at a full-blown rose in an arrangement and they'll say, let's get this one, it's bigger, the rose is bigger. So they don't think the same way we do. And it's very interesting. This study and many others you've done is getting into the minds of how customers really perceive, such as the eye tracking. And a lot of supermarkets now, and I think you mentioned it on one of our calls, has these little computers that they actually track how long in a supermarket aisle people stand there and look at the product. Do they look at the top shelf? Do they look at down below? How long do they look down, or do they not look down at all?
Right.
And I think that is so interesting. And I think the more we can do in that genre, the better, because it's simple core customer behavior that sometimes we have bias. We think they look here. We think they like, oh, they love the lily because it's more valuable or more expensive, but maybe they don't. And this really brings kind of an organic look at consumers. They can't even control how they look.
I know.
When you're studying them.
It's fascinating. We can do it in the lab, or we can put special glasses on people that's measuring the response of their pupil when they see something. And we know that there's going to be a response in the eye when they like something. And we can actually put sensors again on their face and measure facial movements, and we can tell which area of the brain is being triggered. And we know that most purchasing decisions arise in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And so we can actually determine that people's likelihood of purchase based off of the responses that we're seeing with all these biometric measurements. So it's really fascinating, but it gives us some good, concrete, realistic things that we can do at the retail level to enhance sales. For example, if you're merchandising and you have a price sign in the display somewhere, if it's on the right side of the display, it's the last thing people look at making their decision.
No kidding.
Yeah. So that's one simple thing. Always put price signs on the right if you're going to have any sort of price signage, or make sure that the flower does draw the eye, right? So make sure that you have the flowers at a reasonable level, and you don't want to put flowers down at people's feet, right? That's the last place that they look. So we can measure the emotion that's being generated within that purchasing environment. And then again, we can actually forecast the likelihood to purchase, and then through the other techniques that we're doing, develop the willingness to pay and actually come down to the actual dollar premium that they're willing to pay. It's a fascinating thing. Now, one more quick thing that just popped in my brain. And so when it happens, it usually comes out my mouth.
It has to come out.
So there was another endowment study that you all funded, that we looked at guarantees on flowers, and that we found that a 2-week guarantee, 14 days, between 10 and 14 days. If you could guarantee that the flowers would last 10 to 14 days, then there's as much as a 17% price premium associated with that. People are willing to pay 17% more if you could guarantee that 10 to 14 shelf life period. And that to me, that was fascinating. And some of the products that are being developed, that's expressed by Floralife, and a lot of things our allied trade folks are developing, man, they're making that shelf life longer and longer, and that's going to help our ability. And why not put a guarantee on it, and therefore capture some of that price premium? There's just the mind of the consumer is endless in terms of what we have to learn about the way people, well, the venues they prefer, the products that they prefer, and the services that they prefer. And we're finding out more and more all the time. But one thing in common is that people like things that enhance the quality of their lives. And we in the floral industry, you mentioned, the 80s and so forth, we had promo floor talking about flowers and so forth. And there's a discussion now about whether or not we need another generic advertising campaign. Whether we get there or not, we need to do more marketing, even if it's at the firm level, to convince people that we really do influence the quality of their mental health and their physical health and so forth. Because I wrote 4 journal articles in 2019. I can't believe the timing of this. It was so perfect, because the pandemic we just went through was a health crisis. And I tried to summarize all the health, well-being benefits of flowers, shrubs, and trees. And it took me 1 journal article back in 2011 to do that. It took 4 journal articles to summarize all the medical research that had been done on the physiological benefits of flowers. And then another journal article that summarized the psychological, cognitive, and so forth benefits of flowers. Then the social benefits that we oftentimes forget about. And millennials, particularly during the pandemic, really responded on Instagram and other social media. That was their socialization, and they used flowers and plants as part of that socialization process. So there's a lot of benefits that we as an industry need to continue emphasizing to influence that. Now here I'm going to pull up my economics hat again, our inelasticity of demand. Right. So we're going to make our demand more inelastic, which means we can raise prices. And if people decrease their purchases, it's not going to be as much as the price increase. So everybody in the supply chain is going to make more money if we do that. So you talked about perception is reality. That's where marketing comes in, as you well know, right? That's part of your bailiwick. And so if we can market these benefits of flowers more effectively, and even more so than what we already have, and show people that their cortisol levels in their body go down in the presence of flowers, if dementia and Alzheimer patients, their memory retention is enhanced in the midst of flowers, right? Those are things that are not about aesthetics. They're about the overall quality of our lives. And that's the one thing I get so excited about that. And I teach a class every semester. It's called socio horticulture. And I give students 4 flowers, for either a succulent or a foliage plant or a 4-inch mum or something. I get 4 times during the semester. I give them 4 different plants. You would have thought I paid their tuition. The first thing they do is they take a selfie with their plant, right? They got their plant there and they're taking a selfie and sticking it on Instagram or wherever. And so to me, that's encouraging that our young consumers will grow into better consumers for floral products in the future. I'm convinced of that. So I think our future is still very bright.
Well, it was funny. I was at a seminar and it had public, it had general population, and it had industry people in it. and it was on care and handling of floral products. And so, of course, if you're an industry person, you're hearing out of this here, care and handling. I need to cut here, do this, dose it this way, all of that kind of thing. As we were walking out, a regular consumer in the audience, not in the industry, looked at her. I said, "Well, how did you enjoy the seminar?" And he said, "You guys make it too difficult." He said, "All the scientific talk," he said, "I know it's important," but he said, "I just love flowers just because I love them." And he said, "Don't make it so difficult." And that really caught my attention, because I thought, we as industry people on the retail side think, "Oh boy, okay,
Right.
the customer buys this bouquet. I better tell them, here's what you do when you get it home. You do this, A, B, C, D, cut it this, change the water, dose it." And
Right.
but it also taught me, which all those things are important, but it also taught me people just buy it because they feel good about it. And how often do we as retailers, especially on the marketing side, help them with that and
Right.
promote that? And I think what you just said made me think of that. And I tell people, I said, it's great to give them information, but if they start thinking that buying flowers and taking care of them is a big chore when you get home, or they think that they're not equipped to do it, like, this plant, how do I take care of an orchid? Oh my gosh, it's got all this, this methodology. We have to remember that first and foremost why a customer buys it.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
exactly what you said with your students.
Now, one of the things, and that brought together to mind another point, is that this is not an uncommon phenomena. The fact that, the economy pulls back a little bit and people buy more flowers. We've seen that in every single downturn over the last 40 years. People
Okay.
buy more flowers whenever they're staying at home more, right? And they're
Mhm.
they're either enhancing their interiors or they're enhancing their exteriors. So they may buy more bedding plants and so forth for the yard, but the inside they're buying more foliage plants, succulents, flowers, cut flowers, and so forth. So we've seen that before. It's just that whenever the recession or that economic contraction ends, then their consumption or their usage goes back to trend. Right. So we've not
Mm,
done a good
okay.
job of
Mhm.
capturing the new people that have come in and the expanded consumption or usage that we've seen. And we just gone through 2 years of, well, really a year and a half after we had to settle down from the first part of COVID, and then consumption of flowers started increasing. So our consumers in 2022 going to continue buying more flowers at the same rate that they did? Well, again, Valentine's Day was kind of a mixed bag. I mean, it was good, but it wasn't great. I'm really waiting to see on Mother's Day and so forth and see how, because to me, that's a more broader predictor of consumer usage of flowers. And so I'm really interested in, I want to, in fact, I'll say this in my webinar. I got an SAF webinar next week, and that's one of my take home points, is that I want to wait and see what the data for Mother's Day is before I conclude anything about 2022.
And so tell me this, just kind of, I know I want to wrap up this conversation on time, respect your time. Um, so as we are making budgets, a lot of the industry, a lot of the retail buyers, Kroger, Walmart, et cetera, are starting to think about budgets. Of course, we've got to create them for 2023. Deadlines usually September, October. So they're starting to think how to forecast 2023. You don't have a crystal ball, but is there anything that we could tell folks to start looking at that may be some kind of signal? Do you think they should think maybe it'll stay the same as Valentine? Do they need to wait till Mother's Day and then base their 2023 planning on that success or failure or in between? What advice could you give folks to look ahead based on everything now that's going on? As you mentioned, the Russia, Ukraine, now we've got a whole other ball of wax to consider.
Right, right. Well, first of all, let me just go back to one of our original points, is that it's going to take the rest of the year for a lot of the supply chain wrinkles to be ironed out. Even though the number of ships off of the Southern California ports or there's fewer than 50 outside of those ports, which is the lowest it's been in several months. So that's a good thing. It's also, since the supply chain is going to be, it's going to take that long, and you got the whole Black Sea corridor that's now being disrupted. So that's going to influence a lot of European markets in terms of flowers. And so it's going to be kind of a toss up there. And they're much more reliant on the oil. Russia produces 10 million barrels of oil a day. They export 6 million barrels. We in the US, we import very little from Russia. And the Ukraine economy is like 187 billion. The Russian economy is around 2 trillion, where we're a $23 trillion economy. So it's not going to really influence us except for fertilizer prices, because a lot of fertilizer inputs come out of Russia, and wheat and corn are big commodities coming out of Ukraine and Russia. So we know there's going to be a disruption on the commodities side. So there's going to be some influence on food prices, which is going to influence CPI, the Consumer Product Index. So while we were coming down in terms of our inflationary pressure, we're going to see the Federal Reserve kick in some interest rate increases to drive down demand, right? So remember, demand pull, cost push, wage push. So they're going to try to handle the demand side. And then these other, on the cost push and the inflationary pressures, it's if we pull down demand a little bit, then that's going to decrease the amount of goods and services that are produced. And so that's going to ease up on the supply chain. So we should see hopefully a soft landing, what we economists call a soft landing. In terms of if the Fed does this right and the economy responds accordingly, then we should see those inflationary pressures decrease slightly. And, consumer confidence right now has taken a dip because of the gasoline prices, which is terribly ironic, because gasoline in most people's household budget is a very small percentage. But when people are at the pump, they look at how the price they're paying at the pump, and they equate that with the economy at large. And they even blame it on the existing administration, right? In terms of, but that's a misnomer. It's not, government had nothing to do with this inflationary pressure. You can they closed the pipeline, it did nothing to do with that. It's supply and demand. It's supply and demand. And you got geopolitical things that are happening that's affecting the supply side. And you've got people coming out of the pandemic worldwide, ramping up production. That's a demand and draw on resources and energy. So again, it's supply and demand. The
basic drivers.
Exactly. So given all that, if there's not an overreaction on the part of businesses to the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, which are probably going to raise them 1.5 to 1.75 basis points, which would put us all the way to a 2% federal funds rate. That's still relatively cheap money, right? So I don't see that's going to curb production and consumption a little bit, but it's not going to throw us into recession by itself. The Russia-Ukraine crisis will not throw us in recession in and of itself. So if we handle this right, again, we'll go in this soft landing. We'll see the inflationary pressures go down, and if people still respond in the same way as they have the last couple of years, they should be buying flowers, shrubs, and trees in much the same way. It's just that I look at historic patterns, and like I said, they usually go back to trend. But hopefully we've done our homework this time, and we've done more in terms of convincing them of the health and well-being benefits and all the things that you and I talked about earlier. And if so, I'm pretty optimistic about 2022. And in terms of planning for 2023, I wouldn't necessarily plan based off of 22's performance. If I'm looking at 2023, I'd go back to 19, 20, 21, and 22. I'd kind of get an average, and then I'd plan for 5 or 10% over that. to me, that's a more realistic, and in terms of, I'm planning both the number of SKUs at retail, if I'm planning the volume that I'm going to try to be moving at retail, that's going to go through my mindset. And I'd rather be more conservative and look kind of an average over these last 4 years and making my forecast for 2023. But it's early in the year. A lot of things change. We didn't even think about Russia and Ukraine a month ago, right?
Yeah, correct. And how we market. And one of the things I just thought of to mention to our viewers is, have you seen, Charlie, that feel good floral commercial video that was produced by Cal Flowers?
Yeah.
I mean, my husband laughed at that when she ripped her eyebrows off. She was doing a facial mask and she ripped it off and her eyebrows went with it. I mean, I just kind of chuckled. My husband laughed, hysterically. And I talked to Steve Dion after that. I said, you wouldn't believe how funny my husband thought that was, because guys don't understand all the facial mask and everything.
Right.
And so I want to tell the viewers, if you haven't seen that, check it out. It's Cal Flowers. Go to their website. It's awesome. And it's free for anybody to use. And I think it's hysterical.
Yeah.
But before we leave, one last thing, Charlie, where can we find you? What do you have coming up next? And I'm curious, you have behind you EAGL. Tell us a little bit about that, because I've not heard of that.
Well, it's Eagle without the last E. It's an executive leadership program, kind of like an executive MBA for greenhouse and nursery growers. It's a grower-oriented program, and I was on a Zoom, and that was my background, and I left this background. But it's in its 10th year. I'm just filling up the 10th cohort right now, and it kicks off in June. We have a strategy, a marketing, a finance, and a capstone session, just like an executive MBA. So it's really been one of the most rewarding educational programs I put together in my 34-year career. And we have an industry benchmarking effort where we collect income statement, balance sheet data that's stemmed off of that. So it's been really rewarding, and it's one of those things that a number of people, well, when are you going to do one for florists? And so maybe sometime, but we'll see.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
And tell me about your doing SAF now. Are you part of their educational packet? Do you do webinars with SAF? Is there a rhyme or reason about where we find you there, and where else can we find you?
Well, it's kind of an ad hoc. I'm chief economist for American Hort, which is the kind of the corollary to SAF with the rest of the ornamentals, and I don't carry that title for SAF, but I guess I'm the kind of the closest thing to that for SAF. And so usually I'm at convention and so forth. I'm at Cultivate, which is American Hort's big trade show. And so I usually go where I'm asked to speak, and that's usually a lot of places.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
I can vouch for that. Well, thank you so much, Charlie. Charlie Hall, guys, be sure, I can't tell you enough. Not only is he interesting in what he relays to the industry, but how he presents it as well. And he's a music lover also, I know, because we sat together on a flight and we didn't talk much, but we enjoyed our music together. Right. And that was a great time meeting there as well. So guys, if you're listening to this webinar, be sure to look Charlie up. You'll find, things as fast as things are changing, Charlie's information is going to change right with it, as you've heard today. And so also don't forget, folks, to join us at Flori Expo 2022. Used to be International Floriculture Expo. That'll be in Miami Beach Convention Center, June 7th to 9th. So you won't want to miss that. And thank you so much again, Charlie. I've enjoyed our talk.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it too. Thanks for inviting me.
See you soon.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.